My name is Huang. I am the chapter head of the Portland chapter here at the Platypus Affiliated Society. The Platypus Affiliated Society is a campus-based group established in December 2006, which organizes reading group, public fora, research, and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old, new, and post-political left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. We hold weekly reading groups on the history of Marxism. They are at the PSU library across the park in room 390 every Tuesdays at 6 p.m. And we also hold weekly coffee breaks discussions, which are more informal and contains more conversations about current events on the left. And these are meeting also at the PSU library, the third floor study tables, Wednesdays at 6 p.m. So let me begin by introducing our panelists. Sitting right next to me is Professor Joel Benin. Joel Benin is a Donald J. McLaughlin Professor of History and Professor of Middle East History. Emeritus at Stanford University, his research and writing focus on the social and cultural history and political economy of modern Egypt, Palestine, and Israel, and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. After receiving his PhD from the University of Michigan in 1982, he taught at Stanford from 1983 to 2019 with a hiatus as Director of Middle East Studies and Professor of History at the American University in Cairo in 2006-2008. In 2002, he served as President of the Middle East Studies Associations of North America. He has written or edited 12 books and over 50 academic articles and book chapters. His most recent book is A Critical Political Economy of the Modern Middle East, published by Stanford University Press in 2020, and co-edited with Bassam Haddad and Shireen Sekli. Sorry. Sitting next to Joe Benin is Ian Wallace. Ian Wallace has kicked around the Pacific Northwest left for the last 40 years, give or take. He is a carpenter and a general malcontent. He has participated in a variety of left-wing organizations and projects, for better or for worse. And who's Doug Lane, whose voice is coming from the speakers, and
Hello.
Now projected on the projector behind us, is a science fiction writer, editor-in-chief of Sublation magazine, and the host of the Diet Soap podcast. Yeah, anything else you want to add, Doug?
No, I'm not a track coach. I'm not the last Marxist. No, I can't add anything beyond that.
All right, so let me read out the panel prompt for this evening panel. So this evening panel is entitled, What Was Neoliberalism? The present seems to be defined by confusion and disarray on the left. The new left of the 60s, 70s envisioned they were working toward an alternative to capitalism. We now understand that alternative was just a new form of capitalism called neoliberalism. By contrast, ever since the fallout of the 2016 presidential election, many leftists expressed their discontents with neoliberalism by rejecting austerity and identity politics. Is the Millennial Left's rejection of neoliberalism today merely rationalizing the entrance of yet another new era of capitalism? Should the left support ostensibly anti-neoliberal figures like Bernie Sanders, AOC, and Zohran Mamdani as alternatives to capitalist politics? Does their opposition to neoliberalism point beyond capitalism, or are these politicians just disgruntled with the Democrat Party's neoliberal leadership? What's the relationship between opposing neoliberalism and opposing capitalism more generally? Are the aforementioned political figure promising to overthrow capitalism, or are they promising to manage capitalism more responsibly in order to maintain it in perpetuity? So just to go over the format for this evening panel, each panelist will have 15 minutes of opening remarks, followed by a round of 5-minute each of responses to each other, and then we will open up the discussion for Q&A from the audience. Apologies, I will now. Apologies, give me a second. I will begin my timer. Okay, so if you can look to me once in a while, I will give you a warning at the 5-minute mark. So why don't we begin with Professor Joe Benin?
It's Benin, but don't worry about it because most people get it wrong. Even Amy Goodman did yesterday. So thank you all for coming, and to the Platypus Society organizers. I'm a historian, as Wang said, so I'm going to try to speak to some misunderstandings in the terminology and the chronology of the prompt by giving you a potted history of the left since the 60s. Much of the 1960s New Left was in fact not anti-capitalist. My understanding of the 1960s is that there was a broad social movement which included a socio-cultural revolution and a related and sometimes allied set of political movements. The social cultural movement has been the most enduring. Both the elements cutely summarized in the slogan drugs, sex, and rock and roll, and more substantively, the structural changes in the social and economic role of women and the composition of families and more inclusive understandings of gender and sexuality. We are still very far short of equality for women, but only retrograde reactionaries would argue that women aren't equal to men in the way that dominated the pre-World War II culture and politics of the United States and Western Europe. Opposition to this socio-cultural revolution has mobilized reactionary movements rooted among evangelical Protestants and the Catholic Church, based on opposition to abortion rights and gay marriage. People like Anita Bryant, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and the Moral Majority. On the political plane, there were three main, related, but mostly not organizationally integrated struggles. 1, the civil rights and the black liberation movements. 2, the anti-Vietnam War movement. And 3, second wave feminism. There were also ethnically based movements of Chicanos, Asian Americans, especially Chinese and Filipinos, and what was then a gay and a lesbian movement, usually more narrowly focused than today's general gender activism. The civil rights and black liberation and related struggles of ethnic minorities created a path of upward mobility for aspiring middle-class people of color. Most of the other political gains of this era have been or are currently being reversed or limited. Only a relatively small minority of those who participated in these movements developed into conscious anti-capitalists, and only a minority of the New Left remained politically active radicals after the United States troops were withdrawn from Vietnam as a result of the 1973 Paris Peace Accords, and the end of the war itself in 1975, though for the women's movement, the impending defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment in 1977 marks a decline of major significance. Many of those who did remain active joined one of the several organizations that comprised what was called the New Communist Movement, a little bit arrogantly. The Black Panther Party and some veterans of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee led the way in this direction. From fragments of the largely white Students for a Democratic Society, there emerged two main anti-capitalist orientations. One, which I would call playing at arms struggle, and that's the Weather Underground. Zay Dorn, the son of Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn, has made a brilliant podcast series entitled Mother Country Radicals. It's worth listening to just for its own sake. And second orientation was an effort to revive radical working class politics. In many ways, it was looking backwards to the 1930s as a model, and therefore it didn't understand that the working class that it was actively trying to organize was in the process of being relocated to the global south. The biggest organizations in this current were the October League, later called the Communist Party USA Marxist-Leninists, and the Revolutionary Union, later the Revolutionary Communist Party. In both cases, we're talking about organizations with no more than a few thousand members, and there were smaller organizations led by blacks, Chicanos, and Asian Americans. These movements were largely defeated by the late 1970s. However, they had an continuing influence in the trade union movement because hundreds of New Left student activists, myself included, had gone to work in factories and other working class jobs. They contributed importantly to organizations like Miners for Democracy, which was established in 1972 in the United Mine Workers Union, Teamsters for a Democratic Union, established in 1975, and several opposition caucuses in the United Auto Workers Union, who came belatedly to victory only several years ago. And there was also the influential newsletter Labor Notes, established in 1979. What became known as neoliberalism began as a set of Eurocentric, ultra-free market ideas promoted by the Mount Pelerin Society, which was established in 1947 to oppose both communism and the social liberalism of the New Deal and the ideas of John Maynard Keynes. This intellectual opposition to the terms of the post-World War II global capitalist order, which was established at the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference, were promoted by the Austrian economists Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, and taken up later by Milton Friedman and others at the University of Chicago Economics Department. These ideas were considered totally marginal, even outlandish, until the crisis due to declining profits, capital accumulation, and productivity manifested in a decade of stagflation in the 1970s. The ascent of Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in 1979 and Ronald Reagan as President of the United States in 1980 symbolize on the political level the offensive to resolve the crisis on terms favorable to capital. This included, first and foremost, breaking the power of trade unions, privatizing public assets, deregulating and financializing the economy, and cutting back the social welfare state. And, as opposition to these measures and the social dislocation they caused increased, also expanding the police and carceral system. These measures characterized the regime that came to be known as neoliberalism. At that point, the New Left was long dead. It had nothing to do with the installation of neoliberalism, and only renegades like David Horowitz ever embraced it. I never heard of the term Millennial Left before I was invited to this panel. Subsequently, I realized that this is a term that the platypus folks like. I would suggest that it is a category error to think of left as a term too closely identified with specific generations. And I don't think this is a helpful way to describe the period of the retreat of the global left in the 1990s and 2000s. During the 1990s, neoliberalism and globalization, as embodied in the Thatcherite slogan, "There is no alternative," and Francis Fukuyama's 1992 book, The End of History and the Last Man, which argued that liberal capitalism was the culmination of human civilization, were ascendant. In 2000, Perry Anderson, former editor of the British New Left Review, who remained closely connected to the journal, argued that all the currents of the 20th century Marxist left and the socialist project had suffered a historic defeat. This judgment was much broader than a verdict on the Soviet Union, which collapsed in 1991. Almost by definition, no new leftists embraced Soviet-style communism. The New Left Review was established in 1960 to mount an ideological critique of Soviet communism. Many of its editors and authors had Trotskyist leanings, but not all. Anderson was making a judgment that Marxism-Leninism and the vision of a revolutionary alternative to capitalism it embodied, as well as the less radical social democratic project, had both failed. These are the circumstances for the emergence of what might be called a new left, which was largely not continuous with the movements of the 1960s and early 70s. But its first major expression was the 1999 Battle of Seattle against the globalization move of capital and the formation of the World Trade Organization. This internationalist, and that should be underlined, internationalist, anti-globalization movement, maintained its momentum for the next 2 years and petered out after the anti-G8 protests in Genoa, Italy in July 2001. But even as the trade union movement was being decimated, there were exceptional events like the 15-day victorious 1997 UPS strike that was heavily supported by Teamsters for a Democratic Union and labor notes. I mention this to suggest that while there was a rupture in the 1990s, there are also elements of continuity. After all, the International Workers of the World represented workers at Powell's Books in the 2000s, and today the Burgerville Union is still an affiliate. This is the context for the defeat of the anti-globalization and anti-neoliberal movements of the first years of the 21st century. They were not defeated because of cowardice or ideological unclarity, although there was a good deal of ideological unclarity, largely because people didn't understand that the American working class that they were trying to organize no longer existed in its historic form. A major conjunctural boost to U.S. and European imperialism aided the demise of the left because of the 9/11/2001 terrorist attacks in New York and D.C. that re-energized a jingoistic nationalist imperialism, resulting in the U.S. invasions and forever wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, with support from Tony Blair and the United Kingdom. This allowed the terms of struggle to be rearticulated as Islam versus Western civilization. And some leftists, especially those influenced by Trotskyism, embraced that orientation. Christopher Hitchens is probably the most prominent person of that sort. The continuing plausibility of anti-worker, center-left, third-way politics of the 1990s, expressed by Bill Clinton's Democratic Leadership Council and Tony Blair's New Labour in the UK, as an opposition to neo-imperialist projects like the global war on terror and the false premise of a progressive era initiated by the Obama presidency, also helped some vision of the left survive. The failure of small socialist organizations that persisted, like the SWP in Britain and ISO in the United States, to understand that clinging to the political models developed by the 20th century left was no longer viable, was a point of tension during that entire period. They only came to realize their dead-end trajectory when the SWP underwent a crisis over allegations of sexual assault by a leading member in 2013, and the International Socialist Organization was dissolved in 2019, and most of the members joined the DSA. The 2010s were a period of revival of the left. The landmarks of the decade are, first and foremost, Occupy Wall Street of 2011, but it failed to leave a mark because of its anarchist orientation. By that, I mean that there was intentionally no program, no ideology, and no organizational structure. Occupy was succeeded by several social democratic electoral mobilizations. The Bernie Sanders campaign of 2016 and 2020, the victory of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the other members of the squad in 2018, followed by other victories of Summer Lee and Delia Ramirez in 2022 and Greg Casar in 2024. So despite the defeat of Marie Newman, Jamal Bowman, and Cori Bush, who is running again in 2026, this social democratic organization grew. And note, too, that all three of those who were defeated on the question of Palestine. So we'll come back to that. So these folk are nominally anti-capitalist, but in practice what they are seeking is a restored and expanded New Deal, or the Scandinavian model of managed capitalism. And the same is the case for Jeremy Corbyn's movement in the British Labour Party. Bernie et al. propose a political revolution, but they do not advocate the overthrow of capitalism, which is not a plausible project in the current conjuncture. Nonetheless, we know that these were potentially serious challenges to capital because of the efforts mounted to defeat Bernie and Jeremy. So the issue here is that these guys were not revolutionaries, but capital understood that they were serious enemies nonetheless. In the United States, electoral social democracy has to play on the court of the Democratic Party, which is ultimately a party of capital. So this can't produce socialism, which I would define as the end of the rule of capital over labor. The Democratic National Committee, the national leadership of the Democratic Party, at least nominally, would rather lose an election than see someone like Bernie win. But without a revitalized trade union movement, there is no basis for a socialist party or any other mass-based party to the left of the Democratic Party. And then there is the whole other problem of the structural constraints of the two-party system in the United States, which is particularly undemocratic. That's the story, most of the story, in the United States. There's an international element to this story as well. Leftists should always be looking at the international scene and international connections. So at the same time, or even 10 months before Occupy Wall Street, there were massive Arab popular uprisings in Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, Bahrain, Libya, Yemen, and smaller ones in Morocco and Jordan. And that movement was defeated, but it was followed by new waves of insurgency in 2016-17 in Morocco, in 2019-21 in Algeria and Sudan, and in Morocco as we speak. The Gen Z 212 protest is going on. All of these uprisings, except for the current one in Morocco, were defeated. If you want to understand why and what they were about, I would highly recommend two books by Gilbert Achcar. One, The People Want, which was written early on, and two, Morbid Symptoms, which references a quote from Gramsci. Very, very important analysis of this phenomenon, which connects it, first of all, analyzes it as a crisis of capital accumulation and governance, so connects it, therefore, to the ongoing crises of capital accumulation in the Western Europe and North America. What's new?
Yeah, we're up for time. You can just...
Can you give me 2 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, because I'm done. I'm here. What's new? What's new is the centrality of Palestine. So for many, 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 many years on the left, there was a thing called progressive except Palestine. Today, it's clear that there is no progressive without Palestine. Palestine has become the symbol and the emblem of the revival of whatever left we have today. And we saw that at all sorts of levels in the electoral process. Listen to Michigan, the uncommitted in the 2024 campaign. Zohran Mamdani, who came out of the Palestine solidarity movement as a student. The salience of Palestine for those three squad members who were defeated, Jamal Bowman, Cori Bush, Delia Ramirez. As I said, Cori's going to run again in 2026. We'll see how well she does. So there's been a sea change in what it means to be left with this emergence of Palestine, which is an international question and therefore very different from what the American left has been used to, which is usually very insular. And of course, this whole story that I've told you raises the question, are the only options anarchism, Leninism, or social democracy? Thank you.
I've got it.
Next up, Ian.
So I'm not an academic. I'm not going to take up the question of when neoliberalism started, if it's over, when it died. I don't get paid for that, so I'll let others endeavor there.
I don't get paid for that either.
The thing that I probably have to offer is a social history about the era of neoliberalism from a leftist perspective that started early. It started kind of before I was born. My grandmother was a member of the American Communist Party, and my grandfather was a union organizer. And I was born into the New Left. My parents met each other in Haight-Ashbury in 1969. So I was ground zero in the New Left and grew up in it. My mother worked at a cooperative bakery that was a communist bakery in Eugene, and my father was worked at a cooperative daycare center in Eugene in the 70s. So this is literally like my earliest memories was like the ecology of the New Left, and it's like failures and final destruction. When I was about 5, I moved to Seattle, and we moved to a place on Capitol Hill in like a hippie cooperative household, and we lived just down the street from the Safeway that the George Jackson brigade had bombed like maybe a year before we moved in. Now, they were an organization of the New Left that carried out about 11 bank robberies, I think, and 16 or so bombings. The Safeway they bombed was they put a bomb in the Safeway store, and it blew up a bag of dog food. And I was actually, this was a place that my family would be shopping a year and change from then. I was actually in the room with Ed Mead, who was one of the people that was the guy that was supposed to call the bomb threat in, so they cleared the store. And he was just like amazingly nonchalant about like domestic terrorism. It's, I think, important to remember that a good chunk of the world wasn't engaged in communist insurgencies around the entire planet. And the United States had been kicked out of Vietnam after 20 years of fighting there. So I feel like it's important to contextualize the activity in the global circumstance, because it could have gone in any different ways in the 70s. I oppose that sort of urban guerrilla domestic terrorism, regardless of the context we're in right now. I think it's a dead end. My parents basically got straight jobs working in unionized trades. My father was a printer and my mother was a baker in the Teamsters Union. They weren't particularly political in how they raised me, and they didn't talk all the time about politics. But when you have conversations with them now, and you're like, oh yeah, that was like, you guys were a bunch of commies. Absolutely. So the Sandinista revolution was successful in 1979, and this was sort of like a similar event, I think, in parts of the American left, because it was like a successful communist revolution in the United States. And was one of the early stories that kind of started to form my political understanding of the world. after after I started getting old enough to sort of like develop my own political ideas, I gravitated towards an organization called CISPIS, which is Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, which was basically doing political activities in the United States and then raising money to send to the guerrillas in El Salvador who were buying guns and ammunition with the money. So at the time, the outward presentation of CISPIS was a very, you'd even think of it as liberal presentation, but I didn't come to understand until years later, talking to CISPIS people, you know, maybe a decade and change later, that they're actually, you know, materially supporting armed revolution in El Salvador. The reason that I gravitated towards El Salvador and that organization was the massacre that occurred in a town called El Mozote, and I believe it was 81, where they killed, it was a relatively small massacre for the era. It was like they killed 150 people, but it was like the most blood-curdling, terrifying event that you could read about. I'm not going to go into it because it's awful. But that really turned me against the American state. Now, when we think about, to tie things back to Palestine and being radicalized on the left by it, like that definitely radicalized me and a fair number of people. When we look at what happened in Central America, you know, the Sandinistas successfully overthrew the government. Then the U.S. backed the Contras. There was like about 75,000 people that died during that war. El Salvador had similar numbers. 75,000 people or so died. In Guatemala, 200,000 people were murdered by the state, mostly Mayan indigenous people. And the United States government paid for that, trained those people, supported it, and ran cover for it. So I was never able to forgive my country for that, and that's been decades and decades and decades ago. So I have no doubt, like, seeing the horror unfolding now is going to have similar impacts on people, and that's going to be terrifyingly useful for radicalizing people. It's horrible. I'm not trying to look for any glass half full. You know, Guatemala is like a day's drive out of Texas. So there was a lot of people that were being brought up from down south and hidden in the Pacific Northwest and a hole around the whole country. Through CISPIS, I kind of gravitated towards Trotskyism. The other thread in my life, which would become a deeper gravity well, was punk rock and anarchism that punk rock essentially created in the 80s and the 90s, and, you know, arguably it's still around. So the social conditions in the United States in, say, 1980, which sort of underpinned my coming of age politically, were fairly horrific. When we think about, I wrote all these things down because I'm not going to remember them. So we talk about stagflation and whatever, you know, what that meant for people. So the interest rates at that time were like pushing 16%. in 1980, interest rates were like at 16% to buy a house. At the highest rate that we've seen in like most people's millennials lifetime were relatively recent, around 7%. The unemployment rate in 1982 was 11%, which is higher than the unemployment rate that it was during the Great Recession. In the inflation, 5 minutes? Okay. Inflation was much higher too. By the time I graduated from high school, I had lived in 16 different houses. Point being is that the social dislocation that occurred during that era and the beginning of neoliberalism was like pretty intense. So when the whole millennial boomer fight happened, I got to be honest with you guys, I was a little on team boomer because I was there with them. So Trotskyism basically was very short-lived for me. I was part of this group that responded to a punk rock riot that the police came and smashed us up, and we had a big riot. It was great. And we set up a youth group that tried to respond to that. And the Socialist Workers Party took that group over and ran it into the ground in like 3 or 4 months and ran most people out of there. I left them and moved into, I don't remember the organization. It was one little grouplet that there's like one guy in Seattle, and joined this organization for like 3 weeks. And I left that organization because my mother was organizing abortion rights rallies, and he was sitting here telling me how they'd never let a Trotskyist or real revolutionary speak on the stage. It's big marches. So I actually talked to her and got him a spot on the stage, and he was like backed out, not going to do it. So I just gravitated towards anarchism because of that, because Trotskyism was like everywhere I turned in the sectarian left was just bullshit and wasn't very fun. So for me, neoliberalism was like the first 20 years or 25 years of my life was just like kind of chaotic pandemonium. My parents did a great job, but like it was a mess. I moved into when the anti-globalization movement began. I joined the IWW. I was in the WOBs here locally from about 97 to 2005. Participated in the WTO events. We weren't really trying to organize workers that didn't exist. We just didn't have the resources to organize the workers we were trying to organize, which were really like service workers and workers that worked in restaurants or construction workers, residential construction workers. So I feel like our shortcomings were like lack of personnel and lack of resources, and not to say that if we had more resources, we would have done any better. I don't know. We didn't have them. So to me, that's neoliberalism. Was that 5 minutes?
All right. Why don't we have Doug?
Okay. My turn now? All right.
Yes.
Well, I'm going to start by talking about something other than neoliberalism. You're going to talk about the millennial left for a moment. And I want to say that I resent millennials generally as a group. They were the first generation that came along and alerted me to the fact that as a Gen Xer, I was no longer young. The advertisements weren't targeting me anymore. I had become irrelevant. And their attitudes have always struck me as a little bit patronizing, holier than thou. They've got all of the worst qualities of the boomers, and none of the insider irony. But having said that about the generation as a whole, I want to defend the notion that there was such a thing as a millennial left, and that I want to point out that every generation has been tasked with changing society since at least the term teenager was invented, and that we would be remiss to ignore that fact, and that therefore each generation will have a left, and it will either take up the task of changing society or attempt to, or will fail to. I think Gen X largely failed to take up the task. The millennials made an effort. It failed, and for a variety of reasons. The Zoomers, the jury's out. We'll see. They look to me like they're going to be a repeat of Gen X, but boomers, old new leftists, are motivated to ignore the reality that each generation is tasked with changing society. They're motivated to erase the idea that there was a millennial left moment, because by doing so, they remain hegemonic. The new left continues. The struggle as it was understood in 1968 continues, in a regressed form. So you could think back to the 2020 Democratic Party convention and how they played "There's Something Happening Here" as a song of defiance against Republicans, and but also firmly a song of the establishment, and recognize that not only does the old new left benefit from the erasure of the notion of a millennial left, but so do the Democrats, which is a party that has completely absorbed the left for my entire lifetime. So don't listen to those people who would say that there aren't new opportunities in each generation. Don't listen to those who would say that all there is the old story of the new lefts to turn to, and with all the familiar beats about movements and how the 60s were as much about cultural change as it was about politics. Don't listen. Also, don't listen to Bill Ayers at all. He represents the absolutely worst tendencies within that old left, the old new left. I saw him in Chicago and confronted him directly in my way. All right, so neoliberalism. What is it, and why did it arise? I think that it's interesting to blame the left for ushering in neoliberalism. I think it's a little dangerous to blame the old new left for that as well. It is absolutely true that the new left, when it was started, when there was a letter to the new left written up, it was a letter against the Fordist New Deal statist projects that defined both the United States and the Soviet Union at the time, the bureaucratic or technocratic progressive left. That is what the new left wanted to overcome by embracing liberalism. Liberalism as in individual rights and civil liberties and societal change, meaning political change coming from society rather than the state. So I think that the New Left was defeated in 1968. I wrote a book called Billy Moon, which was about the May student worker strikes of 68, and did quite a bit of research for that novel. It came out in 2013. It came out late because it came out after Occupy Wall Street, which was a moment where the spirit of 68 came back and was defeated yet again. The question in the Occupy moment was, can we create a politics that will not be usurped by either party or put into service of Wall Street or the economic order, but will stand opposed to it? Unfortunately, the methods of the Occupy Wall Street movement were very much anti-political. There was no ambition to build something that could become a party that could challenge the capitalist politics of our time. It was more an expression of dissatisfaction and an embrace of aspects of the progressive left Democrats, which became clear soon enough after the Occupy Wall Street movement was put down, both kind of willingly put down. Like there was a coordinated effort by the Occupy Wall Street movement to accommodate the coming crackdowns. But soon enough after Occupy failed, you had Occupy Democrats arise, which was always the trajectory that the movement was headed towards, because there wasn't adequate self-reflection or time in 2011. But neoliberalism versus a New Deal, because that is how in the 80s and the 90s, all through to today, the left has understood neoliberalism. It's understood the Clinton years as a betrayal of the Democrats' true politics. It's understood its political goals to be about redistribution of wealth and the proper management of the state. But that turn towards trying to kind of a nostalgic embrace of the New Deal was itself the result of memory holing what the New Left that ended up there had originally been about. Let's see, I took some notes during the other, let's see. Oh, I want to say that this is something Spencer Leonard told me today during the podcast, that the Christian right often enough is successful because they step forward to represent basic kind of bourgeois values, which are fully embraced by working class people. In other words, ideas like men should work and provide for their families, not that women shouldn't, but that there's dignity in work, and that there should be autonomy for working people, that they want to be self-sufficient rather than rely on even unemployment insurance, let alone welfare checks. So when we're told or directed to whip up a lot of animosity towards this or that right-wing Republican who is pitching himself through the churches and through a kind of quasi-Christianity to voters, we're playing into a culture war that is only going to undermine our efforts to organize beyond this level of politics. There can be as many Christians as there are.
You got 5 minutes left, Doug.
Okay, well, I'm almost done here. I want to say something about the pro-Palestinian movement. The pro-Palestinian movement was a movement concocted to reabsorb the left after Bernie Sanders failed. That's not to say that it was that the Democratic Party directed Hamas or the Israeli state, but the way that it was put together as a protest movement, aimed only to return a disaffected left, millennials and Zoomers both, back into a faction of the Democratic Party. You can see that in the way that the primary things that they did, which was they challenged Biden in quasi primaries with their undecided movement. In other words, they threatened Biden's electoral chances, but toothlessly. And the other thing they did was put together, boycotts and divestment movements, which ultimately would have and had no true effect on the military decisions and the policies of the states. It was about morale boosting and maintaining a campaign that would ultimately feed into the Democratic Party. And so we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that just because the cause is noble and that the violence is horrific, that means our politics are effective or even decent. I don't think the pro-Palestinian movement was either. Anyhow, I'll leave it there.
Okay. All right. So now we will. Okay, so now we will move into the response section of the panel. Each panelist will get 5 minutes to respond to each other's remarks. We'll go in the same order as the panelists gave their opening remarks. So, Joe Benin, your 5 minutes starts now.
Wow. Doug Lane and I live in a different universe. Pro-Palestinian politics was invented to direct people back into the Democratic Party. Anybody recognize? Yeah. Does anybody out there recognize that as part of reality? No. It has nothing to do with reality. So if you end on that note, then pretty much you should disbelieve everything else he said, because this is a person who isn't grounded in what most of the rest of us recognize as reality. What I tried to do was talk simultaneously about generational shifts in the progress and rise and decline of the left without rooting things specifically in a generation. Now, young people always think that we're the hottest new thing and old people don't understand and boomers go to bed and all that kind of thing. And there's a certain amount of legitimacy to that because, after all, we're the ones who are responsible for handing you the world as it is today, which is not in great shape. On the other hand, when I graduated college and joined a left organization that sent me to work in auto plants in Detroit, I wanted to know, how do you do that work? How do you organize workers? What's the scene here? And there was hardly anybody around to help me understand that, because McCarthyism had broken the old left. So the old left had many, many ideological problems, first and foremost the Soviet Union. The Trotskyists were no better. Both of them, that led to a whole dead end. But many people who had been in the Communist Party had spent long years in the trade union movement and knew how to be labor organizers, at least, even if they parroted the line of the Soviet Union, but they were gone. So we couldn't rely on those people, and therefore we almost were compelled to invent a certain story about what their experience had been like, which led to another dead end of Maoism. So generational continuity is actually super important because, after all, what we would call the left, which has nothing to do with the Democratic Party. My God, if anybody thinks that playing around at the Democratic National Convention in 2020 has anything to do with anything you would call left, then they're also in a different universe. But what we would call the left today has its roots in the French Revolution and then in the revolutions of 1848 and the Paris Commune of 1870 and so on. So if you insist that every generation has a new task and every generation has to do things differently, you give away what is one of the most valuable assets of the left, which is that the left represents, going all the way back to the French Revolution, a tradition of liberty, economic equality, that if you wanted, you could even go all the way back to the Enlightenment. It's the left wing of the development of all of European modernity. So, yes, of course, each generation faces somewhat different conditions. But if your premise is that every previous generation failed because they were ideological nincompoops or cowards or whatever, no, you won't get anywhere at all.
He's got the red. Whatever one you want.
I'm going to use the red one.
Green is the color of Islam, so that means that I was a Hamas terrorist.
Yeah. I'm going to stick with the red one. Yeah, I mean, look, I was radicalized by American travesties and what the genocidal shit it carried out, you know, and it's doing it again. And this is an old story. This is America, so I don't think that what happened in Central America in the 80s led to socialism in the United States. I don't think what's happening in Palestine right now is going to lead to socialism in the United States. If people feel moved to organize in there, like, I feel that they should. But, you know, for me right now, I feel like the reason I'm becoming involved politically at all again is because I feel like the left has just completely collapsed and been subsumed into the academy and its political economy, and is now essentially just a structure that is sort of an intra-middle class contest for jobs. And like, that's not going to speak to the working class, and that the left, having completely collapsed and is non-existent in the working class, leftists may have an open field there in a way that they haven't for a long time. If they get their foot back in there, at least get one foot back within working class people's lives. And I'm not convinced it matters too much what you're doing there, just that you're being allowed to be informed by the struggles and concerns of people's daily lives. And that's going to look a lot different everywhere, different communities. It's going to look different. And we shouldn't be judgy about that. And we should, you know, let there be a good amount of freedom about how the left interacts with working class people, and not try to prefigure what that's going to look like too much, because we don't fucking know. Like, if there's anything clear from my experience in my life, is the left does not know. So let's try to figure it out.
I want to point out that when I claimed that the pro-Palestinian movement was about bringing a disaffected left that had been defeated after supporting Bernie back into the party. I didn't just make that claim, flat. I gave a couple of examples to back up the claim. The examples were the actual political goals of the movements that emerged after October 7th. And those goals were divestment, demanding universities divest, which would only move money around, wouldn't really hurt or slow down the bombardment of Gaza, and the kind of toothless and decided movement, which wanted to push the Biden administration to be more vocal about caring about the Palestinian people. You could see that acted out, not in 2020 at the DNC, where they did co-opt New Left imagery and ideology, but at the 2024 Democratic Party convention, where the pro-Palestinian movement basically died on the steps of the convention hall, crying to be given a spot, to have a pro-Palestinian speaker at the convention. I'm not saying that the Palestinians movement for themselves is about the Democratic Party. No, it's not. But in the United States and throughout the West, the pro-Palestinian movement has been about reinvigorating whatever so-called left capitalist parties there are, and sometimes in a complicated way. But if you look at the way these organizations that organized the protest were funded, you can see a direct connection between the Democrats' funding mechanisms and these supposedly independent left organizations that organize the pro-Palestinian movements. So I have some evidence for what I'm saying. You just flatly stood on the authority of received opinion, which is a common tactic amongst those who think they have the crowd with them, which you probably do. As to the millennial left having a unique task, that doesn't mean you have to ignore history. I would say that the new left's major accomplishment has been to ignore history, to ignore their own defeats, to ignore learning or the need to learn and to change as history has changed, as history has changed our conditions. So I'm not saying that we have to throw everything aside and ignore the past. I'm saying we have to learn from it. And when we keep repeating the same slogans, when we keep repeating the same received opinions and the same strategies over and over again, knowing full well that they won't ever lead to socialism, admitting as we go that there's no way these approaches can lead to a socialist movement, but instead lowering the horizon to the level of supporting progressive capitalists in whatever mealy-mouthed way we do it. The result will be the continued defeat, diminishment of that left tradition that you say you want to embrace, that goes all the way back to the Enlightenment. And I hope that wasn't too judgy.
Judgy. And based on no evidence, by the way. You don't have.
I just gave you some evidence.
That is not evidence. What you said. There is no evidence.
Okay. All right. Let's open up to the audience. Do they need to use the mic at all or no?
Point it as close as we can get.
Just line up on the right side and just literally pass them the microphone.
That's true.
Oh yeah, just walk up to where he's at, and then just so people at home can hear.
Check how much slack there is in the line there.
I think the red might have. You understand?
Okay, I have a question for Professor Joel Bevin. And closer, I'm trying. No. And it's in your opening. You referenced that the tactics of the New Left were focused on maybe these aren't your exact words, but the traditional proletariat, I think, is that fair? No, that's not what you said? On this kind of working class,
20th century organizing
yeah,
model
20th
based on the
century,
idea of the working class.
yeah, you've got these, you kind of criticize the 20th century organizing model based on the working class, but
Most of the New Left didn't do that.
right. Okay. So what I was asking is there a different kind of model that they were using that they thought could change the world, or is there a model that you think that they should have been using other than the old 20th century working class model? That's my question of the old left. Yeah.
So if we're talking about socialism, the subject of the socialist project has to be a working class. The problem, I mean, you can talk about all sorts of other kind of political changes, even positive political changes that don't amount to socialism. But socialism means the rule of the working class and the defeat of the rule of capital over the working class. So everybody who became a socialist of whatever kind they became understood that. But then we're talking again about a small fraction of the New Left. Most of the New Left was focused on its particular project. So anti-Vietnam War, I mean, that wasn't disconnected from socialism because after all, there was a global array of anti-imperialist national liberation movements who were led by people who were nominally socialists, but in every single case, the socialist element was stripped out as they came to defeat the colonialists or shortly after. The Black liberation movement was focused on the oppression of black people in this country. Some people who came out of that movement reoriented themselves toward the working class. Some elements of that movement came from the working class, like the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit. That's why everybody went to Detroit, as I did. The women's movement had its own agenda, which, yes, there was socialist feminism, but that tended not to be rooted in the working class, but in various middle class elements. So the thing that happened to us, which we could not understand at the time, was that the people we were trying to organize were being removed from the country. Chrysler, where I worked, was opening up factories in Mexico and Spain. Well, how were we going to organize workers in Mexico and Spain? I mean, yes, in principle, internationalism and the third or the fourth or the fifth, whatever, international, but that never really actually worked. So, I mean, today, where is the working class of the global working class today? It's in China, it's in India, it's in Southeast Asia. So if we're imagining an American working class movement, the working class looks a little different than historically. Today, what sectors of the working class are the most active? Teachers, nurses, service workers, very different than going to work into an auto factory or a coal mine or a steel mill or something like that. Does that change what socialism should look like? That's an open question.
Ian or Doug, do you have any comments? I know you also talked about, the necessity of the left to reconnect with the working class in your remarks. I'm just wondering if you have any comments on that issue.
I mean, honestly, I feel like this notion that the left is looking for the old working class of the 40s or the 60s or something is like, I've met those dudes, but it's mostly not that. I feel like, when we were doing labor organizing here in Portland in the WOBs, when I was really involved in that, we were trying to understand minority unionism, non-contractualism, and like trying to develop industrial standards that could be imposed on the boss. But we weren't looking at, when we'd say industrial unions, we were talking about an industry, not like a type of production. So I feel like most people that want to organize workers know this, and that there are some like dinosaurs that are stumbling around like zombies that maybe have an image of like the white male working class. But I don't really think most people that are thinking about that think that. And I feel honestly like it's a caricature of class politics, which you can find, but I just don't feel like it's as common as one would be led to believe from many conversations you can have on the left.
So let's be.
Can I say something now?
Let's divide by historical period.
Well, you need a speaker stand.
In the 60s, when there still was a big chunk of that traditional working class, to look to them still made some sense, even if the trajectory was wrong, because they were declining. That sector of the working class was declining. Today, to talk about the working class in that way is lunacy.
Can I jump in? I think service sector workers are workers. I think non-union workers are workers. I think the remaining industrial workers are workers. Uber drivers are workers. Bus drivers are workers. Office workers are workers. People who draw a wage and create value for the capitalist system are workers. Organizing them is more difficult than organizing people in the factory, at least in theory, because the idea of the big factory is you draw people together from all sorts of parts of society. You would have the common interests, as that was the reverse side of monopoly capital that also unified working class people, made them more, gave them more of a tendency to work collectively, and getting today's workers to think in a collective way and to organize together is more difficult, and it may have to take place both outside of the workplace and within it. Sublation Media is aligned with, or sort of very interested in, something called the Campaign for a Socialist Party, and the way that the Campaign for a Socialist Party is operating is on the level of direct civil society organizing, at this point more with the aim of learning from this civil society organizing that workers and everyday people are doing just to survive, finding the gaps that exist where the NGOs and the state aren't actually helping people meet their needs, and trying to develop a group of socialists who can step in and hopefully help build what will become a party from the ground up. So I wanted to say that. The other thing I would say is that it's important to recall that the aim of organizing workers, if you're a socialist, is not merely to represent them in terms of their interests as workers, but to put together a party and other organizations, unions, and Soviets or workers' councils and what have you, that would be able to challenge the capitalist rule of the capitalist parties in order to abolish the working class, in order to abolish class society. That's the point of what's called the dictatorship of the proletariat. So when we think about organizing workers, we have to think about that beyond organizing them into blocks, voting blocks or interest groups, or but also organizing them politically, or helping them self-organize politically, helping ourselves self-organize.
Okay. Maybe the gentleman in the back. He had his raised.
I'll try to project as much as I can.
Oh, well, it's for the recording.
It's so Doug can hear you.
Yeah.
Because Doug can't hear unless it's near the
My bad.
Cord control.
Is it still working?
Yeah, it's fine.
All right.
I'll just There was a lot, I'm sorry. I think the first 30 minutes of the intervention in the panel, but I think I caught the second and third panelists, and I got to learn a little bit from the first panelist, Dr. Benin, about what he had to say. I'm going to try to summarize without sowing any discord or more confusion about so far what we've all heard. The first thing is the panel is called What Was Neoliberalism? I think it veered slightly into what are all the problems of the left right now. And we need to keep an eye on the enemy. Neoliberalism is a very serious problem. It did not start necessarily in the 70s or 80s as the classic Marxist interpretation by David Harvey classic, but it's actually from the 1920s. Those were people that in Austria and Germany were primarily concerned about opposing what they thought liberalism was becoming at the end of empires. And therefore they thought we need a new kind of neoliberalism, even though they abandoned the term in the 60s. Past all that, we can see now that it has metastasized. Basically, it's forever mutating, which is why when I saw the question of the panel, I was very amused, because I'm like, wars would mean that it's over, as Gary Gersel argues, but it's not. It's mutating. And at this point, what has happened is liberal, centrists, ecologists, all kinds of political factions in one way or another, including individuals who claim they're not political at all, have adopted many of the tenets of what neoliberals argue, which is like this autonomy, this self-sufficiency, not having to rely on others, looking out for your own interests, trying to survive no matter what, and all of that. Us looking at our cell phones is a classic neoliberal thing where you're trying to find individual happiness instead of hanging out with other people. But I'm gonna, shorten what I need to say and step back on a few things. The second panelist had a very interesting comment at the end of his talk where he said, the left the group that he was part of lacked both personnel and resources. This is a classic problem of the left in general, worldwide. Because the neoliberals, the Atlas Network is their biggest constellation worldwide, do not like either of those two things. And they have centers of, when you see the word freedom, liberty, progress, enterprise, market, any of those keywords in any think tank is usually someone that is subsidized wherever, from Malaysia to Bolivia, to France, to Spain, to Ouagadougou, about neoliberal principles. So they have the money and they're spending it in spades to presumably help people become free and be independent of the state and so on and so forth. But the danger of the argument, the danger of the ideology, not just for the left, who are naturally opposed to those things, but for all of us, is that they're trying to remake the human subject. That means they no longer want us to be humans the way that we were known to be. So that's the first problem. The question that I have for the panelists is, number one, are they overlooking a couple of things? The third panelist mentioned this idea that the millennial left is clueless. I'm not a millennial, I'm a Gen Xer. But actually, we have Gen Xers that are carrying the torch. Are we overlooking people like Thomas Piketty, born in '71, and whose current, not only his book in 2014, kind of made everybody now want to talk about what economic inequality is and wealth inequality, and people are still have to, it's part of the conversation, you can't ignore it. And his current student, Gabriel Zucman, is actually pushing the tax which all neoliberal governments and conservative governments are opposing in Europe. The second thing is, are we ignoring, and this is for all three of you, this idea that in the US, there might be this notion that the way we talk about, quote, the left is problematic because it's so narrow. We don't have any leftist party in the United States. We have some movements like the DSA, but there's no political party. That means a party composed of people who would have a program, which would have an agenda, which if they were to get elected, whether at the national or the local level, would be able to push that program. So that's already a big thing. And we have an example of such a party. In France, LFI, France Unbowed, is very close to the presidential election and eventually holding power, precisely because an ex-Trotskyite, Mélenchon, decided that they needed to move away from the Socialist Party. So are we ignoring this? Are we ignoring two things? Number one, that for every generation, there are people that are actually pushing policies and ideas that are making an impact that is being resisted, that we're not paying attention to, that we don't associate with the left. The second thing is the problem, let's say, for the left in the US where we are now, primarily that we work in groups, do marches, do things, try to understand things, But at the level of electoral politics, where that's all that matters, because you have the guy in the White House now only because he, quote, won the election, we're not thinking about this idea that a political party that will present a program or programmatic leftist ideas, so justice, solidarity against war, against oppression, and so on, needs to take place. Those are my two questions. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, would anyone like to take a crack at the...
You want to come around here and line up? I'll help you out with the
Let me just say, the reason that most of what goes on that is classified as left, very broadly speaking, happens in social movements is because we haven't got the capacity to build an electoral party. So I want to get this right here. The Campaign for a Socialist Party has a Facebook page. Nothing has been posted on it for quite a while. They have 961 followers. You're not taking power in the United States with a Facebook page of 961 followers. The only conceivable way to build a socialist party in a country like the United States is in alliance with trade unions. And the trade unions have been badly defeated. All those other kinds of workers that Doug talked about should be in unions. And if they were in unions, then they could be part of this kind of an effort. But it's very hard to organize those workers. So the structural weakness of the left isn't because ideologically people don't know that we need to have a socialist party. It's because we're too weak to build one. So we do what we can do.
Can I address the thing about how many followers that Facebook page has?
But I just checked.
I want to say that what is being presented, and I understand why, as a weakness is actually the strength of the Campaign for a Socialist Party. We are not a media-oriented campaign. It is, the 961 followers had to find us through various networks, and we're not. Right now, I agree with you that there's no chance for a serious socialist party to develop under these conditions. What has to happen is for socialists to become enmeshed in society in movements that are working class movements that already exist before there can be any electoral party, and before we can advertise as if we have an actual party. We don't have any connection to society. We're cut off. The left is in universities or in think tanks or in small NGOs or big NGOs, but they're not working on the level of everyday life, and they're not connected to the struggles that are actually happening amongst workers and in society. So the aim right now of the campaign is to take a long-term view, not to think that we're going to be able to challenge either capitalist party tomorrow, but instead to redirect those who actually care about socialism towards a long-term project, and not one that's going to be a flash in the pan or get 1 million followers on Twitter or and come and go, as most of these left organizations that I've seen in the last 20 years have done.
Unless another comment. Okay. We want to kind of move through questions quickly, so as many people as possible.
Hi, this question is for you, Joel. I guess in your talk, you had mentioned that you view Occupy as a decay due to anarchism, that they had no program, no ideology, no organizational structure. I'm not sure how tactfully the point was.
That they were actively opposed to the working classes.
You have to speak into the mic.
And I would add to that that they were in certain circumstances actively opposed to the working class.
Well, I'm not sure the point was presented utmost tactfully, but, I am sympathetic to Doug's idea that what we have with the protests against Palestine is much more than that. As, again, horrifying and horrific it, the whole thing is. And I mean, most people in my generation, I think, have been radicalized by that event. Like you described it as a sea change in the left, and I think that's probably true. And I guess my question would be, are we being radical? Like, what are the right things to be radicalized by? And is there a right thing or a wrong thing to be radicalized by? I guess as well, my other question would be, if I can be allowed to, as far as Bernie, I think you described it as sort of like, they wanted to like capitalism didn't want Bernie, right? I don't know. I hear people talk sometimes as though, if we do eventually get social democracy, like European-style social democracy in the United States, all that means is that we've bolstered the labor aristocracy, and that ultimately we're making things worse for the, global South and the third world. So, and I think there's maybe a bit of truth to that. So I guess, so there's that first question, and I'm not exactly sure what that second question was, but yeah, if you have any response. Yeah, sure.
So, people, there's no right and wrong thing to be radicalized by. The problem then becomes, after you've been radicalized, how do you understand the world as a result of that experience? So let's take, for example, the Palestinian movement since October 7th. There was a movement of Palestine solidarity before. Students for Justice in Palestine existed. Jewish Voice for Peace existed. And they were not small organizations by the standards of lefty student organizations. They were not socialist organizations. And the Hamas attack of October 7th, 2023 was not a socialist action. Hamas is a reactionary, misogynist, Islamist organization. We've already seen that even within this very shaky and problematic ceasefire that has existed, that Hamas has used the opportunity to execute its opponents and so settle scores. And they ruled that way for 15 years before 2023. So if you got radicalized by seeing that the United States is funding and diplomatically and politically supporting a genocide, great. If you got radicalized by that experience and then thought that Hamas is the vanguard of global socialism, no, that's a big problem. And why do I mention that? Because there are people who are talking like that. Look at Andreas Malm, for example, on the blog of Verso Books and the debate that he's been having with Matan Kaminer there. Very polite debate, a little bit more polite than the one we're having here, actually. And there are lots of people in the United States who are very substantial elements in the pro-Palestinian movement who don't want to hear any critique of Hamas. The last time I spoke for the Platypus Society was at Oregon State University, where somebody else on the panel and a couple of Palestinian women the Palestinian women were hysterical because that guy was being critical of Hamas. This was a panel on socialist understanding of what was going on there. So, those young women were Hamas supporters and not socialists. So So whatever does it for you is fine. But then study what's going on in the world. That doesn't mean that we're all going to agree hunky-dory. No. The question of how to form a socialist party, the way that Doug laid it out, people have been trying to do that for 75 years and failed. So there's no particular reason to believe that the next good group of people who had that idea are going to do any better. We have a structural problem in this country with the two-party system. We don't have ideological parties in the way that they have had in Europe. So I mean, think if you can back to pre-civil rights era Democratic Party. You had the Roosevelt New Dealers and you had the Dixiecrats, the segregationist Jim Crow people. They're in the same party. And the New Deal had to be based on uniting those disparate factions, which ultimately led to many of the limitations of the New Deal. First and foremost, it's racism. So this is the political universe we live in. We don't live in the European or previous generations of European ideological universe. So it makes it very difficult for us. The question of labor aristocracy. Lenin wrote about that way back before World War I. It's a huge problem. So the only way that I know to address that problem is to keep your eye on what's going on in the world. So it makes perfect sense what Ian did joining CISPES, or other people supported the Sandinistas. I had lots of friends and colleagues who put all their energy into that while I was working on Palestine, because that's what I've done for the last 50 years, primarily, basically since I left the auto factory. So there's not an easy formula for how you avoid that problem, but keeping your eye on what's going on in the third world, now called the Global South, helps. However, it was much easier in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s when you had these anti-imperialist national liberation struggles going on. We don't have that anymore except for Palestine. Palestine, in that respect, is a big exception, but Palestine, the movement in Palestine is not being led by even people who are nominally socialist. I mean, Hamas, no, they're not socialist, and Fatah not either. So Palestine can't play the kind of role that Vietnam or South Africa or El Salvador or Nicaragua did, or the movements in Southern Africa beyond South Africa in the previous decades. So that's also something that needs to be sorted out. I don't have a clear answer. I'm not going to give you like do 1, 2, 3. I don't do that.
And the panel want to cut in? Yeah.
I want to cut in and just say something about the idea of being radicalized. When I was part of a Marxist organization, a sectarian group, one of the things that the leaders like to say was, radical means going to the root. It doesn't mean feeling very alienated. It doesn't mean rejecting society. That can be part of it, but being a radical means that you get to the root of the situation, the root problem, the root contradiction. So when people are radicalized by an atrocity, they're not. They're alienated by an atrocity. They're disaffected by an atrocity. They're woken up maybe. They're pushed to think beyond what they might have believed before. But then to become a radical means thinking through as far as you can to the root contradiction that's creating the problems. So I would encourage you to feel the emotion of and the reaction to the atrocities, but then be cold and think. The other thing I would want to say is that while the political parties in Palestine, especially Hamas, do not represent any kind of hope for socialism, the Palestinian workers, both in Gaza and the West Bank, but in Israel as well, along with the Israeli workers, do represent a hope for socialism. And it's worth recalling that before October 7th, there were massive protests against Netanyahu on the basis of trying to defend civil liberties and make sure that land reform was fair in the West Bank. I forget all the details, but the point is that Israeli civil society was organizing against the Israeli state before October 7th. There were massive protests before October 7th. That's not true? You don't agree?
The
That didn't happen?
the political content is the political content was completely different than what you said.
Well, my understanding is Netanyahu wanted to limit the power of the courts and take more executive authority to make these sorts of decisions, and there was mass movements against that in Israel.
So you had a movement of what we would call the white middle class in Israel, the Ashkenazi middle class, which was terrified that some people might come to those demonstrations and also demand rights for the Palestinians and even beat up those people on several occasions. So no, this was not a movement of the left or of any kind of real progressive character.
Okay, so you don't think that the movement to against Netanyahu, as he attempted to suppress the power of the courts and remove checks against his authority, had any kind of liberal basis? No, I'm not saying it was socialist, but
now you change terms. Yes, it was exactly a liberal movement.
Yeah, right, which is better than Hamas. As a better foundation for change than Hamas. That is better
A liberal
foundation
movement
than
that
some
wanted to
reactionary
oppress the Palestinian people and defeat Hamas. No,
movement.
no.
So you're
Okay.
wait, the Palestinian people and Hamas are the same?
No, they are not. No. No, it has not. It only has to do
So what
with
is
the
it? You're
fact
saying that Palestinians
that this is
are
that this
represented
is-
by Hamas and they're interested in Hamas?
This is abstract theorizing based on pretty minimal knowledge of the concrete conditions of a place. My entire family lives in Israel. I've been there 25 times in the last 50 years. I know a little bit about the place, not very much about the place.
Okay.
Real quick, clearly there's a lot of interest in the issue of the Palestine-Israeli issue. So we should, if we want, we can host a panel on that actually fairly soon, especially since there's a lot of audience interest in this. Right now, though, this panel is about neoliberalism. I do have a bunch of questioners here, so I want to get to them. And then maybe we could try to limit the panelist response to just like a couple of minutes each. I just want to get to as many people as possible.
So no pressure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so both in the opening remarks, but also in one of our audience members' comments, the deep intellectual roots of neoliberalism going back to the 1920s have been raised. And, you know, obviously everyone agrees that the Mont Pelerin Society predates substantially what might be called the neoliberal revolution in the late 70s and 80s. But kind of keying in on those figures like Hayek and von Mises, and I'm going to say provocatively, one of Hayek's colleagues at the University of Chicago, Gary Becker. What about the late 70s, early 80s period allowed their ideas to become politically credible in a way that they had not been before? And I guess maybe just to give two spins on that, does it have anything to do with the cultural changes that the New Left maybe drove forward or just was a part of? Or is it more of an economic story? either way you answer that question, is that political consensus? Is that the strength of the legitimacy of those ideas at a political level breaking down today, and why or why not? And that's addressed to
that for me?
all of the panelists.
Want to go for that? Go
I'm
ahead.
actually most
I
interested in
don't-
hearing from Ian.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But I'm interested in hearing from everyone.
You know, I haven't talked publicly for maybe 10 years or so. What I feel is important is that we draw out the experience of neoliberalism for the working class, how it was experienced by the working class internationally and in the United States. And I feel like that is very underdetermined on the left. And we spend a lot of time talking about the people that organize that shit against us, which I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but I feel like it undermines our capacity to interact with people who are living in that wreckage, because we are creating a context that takes frequently a college education to access, and that this is a deep mistake on the left. So I just feel like if you want to keep one foot in the academy, just get one goddamn foot in civil society. At least get one in one and the other in the other. So I was just trying to draw out, first sort of like experiencing how it was imposed. And then, because I fucking wrote something that was too long, to be honest with you, didn't get to articulate very much how, like, I experienced the far left organizing on the ground in response to it in the 90s and into the aughts, which I regret not doing a better job. But I want people to get out of the fucking academy. That's all I really can say, that again and again and again. That's what has to happen. Because, like, here's the problem with the Socialist Party. You're going to have a bunch of socialists join it. It's a problem.
He's not wrong.
I mean, I love a socialist party. I kind of think we need to start with a workers' party.
You're right, the Socialist Party in France is anything but.
Doug, did you want to say anything?
Yes.
All I would say is that my memory of neoliberalism is that the working class people I knew didn't worry about neoliberalism. They didn't use that term. They sometimes were worried about welfare fraud. They worried about keeping their job. Worried about people on the job who were slacking off. Sometimes that was me. But they, in general, I think that, by the time I was aware of the term neoliberalism in the 90s, it was a fait accompli. It had been ratified by Clinton. It was no longer what people were struggling against. It took a while for the nostalgia for the New Deal to return. But most working class people that I know are most concerned about doing well on the job and maybe getting ahead on the job. They have interests like anyone else that is different for every person. But I had a conversation, this is like I'm turning into Thomas Friedman, so I'm sorry, but I had a conversation with an Uber driver. And he was talking about, as you do, I was talking, well, how is it driving Uber and what do you do? And he has another job, he worked in a warehouse, and he was talking about the struggle to get a higher wage in the warehouse and how long he'd been working there and how he thought that by now he'd be paid at least $25 an hour instead of 20. And I asked him, well, when you were a kid, what did you want to do? What was your ambition? And he said, he didn't understand the question. And then I said, well, like sometimes kids want to be firefighters or astronauts. And he said, oh, okay, yeah. I wanted to be a computer programmer, or actually a computer repairman. And I said, yeah, why is that? And he said, well, because I knew that there would always need people to fix the machines, that the machines wouldn't be able to fix themselves. So even as a kid, this guy was thinking about job security and not about some grand dream. That's so neoliberalism, people accept it if they think it will get them that.
I want to tell you a story about neoliberalism, taking off from what Doug just said, which I agree with. So I'm in the Chrysler auto plant in the mid-1970s, and it's contract time, and what the companies are offering is not great. And the group I belong to, we want to encourage people to go on strike. And people say to us, we can't go on strike because we just came back from a big, long layoff 4 months ago, and we're behind on our house payments, and we're behind on our boat payments, and we're behind on the payments of our cabin in the woods in North Michigan. And people had all these things in auto plants because there had been a strong union that gave them higher wages and job security and all of it. And so now we have to just go back to work and accept a less than good contract because we need to work to pay off our debts. We're in the hole. And not only that, here comes the kicker, our union leaders are telling us that if we do go on strike and if we do force Chrysler to make a better give us a better contract, that they're just going to pick up the plant and take it to Mexico. All right, that's neoliberalism. That's globalization. So not every worker saw it that way, but that was not an uncommon way of understanding what was happening to us. Because it was just the early stages and you don't see the big picture. I mean, as Ian has been reminding us, workers by and large aren't college graduates, although in the Detroit auto plants you actually at that point did have quite a few. That's a very unusual situation there. You have to do two things at once. You have to understand that, yeah, this is the consciousness of a lot of the people you're working with, and you can't be limited by that consciousness because then we're never going to get anything. We won't even get a good contract, let alone that we're not going to get socialism if you're limited by that consciousness.
Briefly, I just want to make a quick statement. Just also to Conrad's point, it was actually only a questioner from the audience so far who has addressed the past tense, what was neoliberalism, which I find highly fascinating. Because, people can disagree with this idea of history that's in the prompt. Clearly, Joel, you did in your opening remarks. But largely the idea of Fordist capital, the regime of accumulation in David Harvey's terms, that saw its high point in the post-war boom of 1945 to 1973, ultimately came into crisis, not just economically, but as a political crisis. And that this political crisis manifested mainly in and through the Democrat Party as the ruling class party. And, the left, maybe his memory holds somewhat that Jimmy Carter was actually the first proponent of neoliberal austerity. And it ultimately just...
memory hold that. Democrats' memory.
Well, because we would rather think of neoliberalism as a fringe Austrian theory that is dominating society from without.
No serious.
Well, I think that you said that in your opening statement.
No, I didn't say that. I said those ideas had been considered marginal. And then with the Reagan-Thatcher political ascendancy,
So to clarify,
they became mainstream.
So to clarify, the idea of a fringe theory that was marginal and became mainstream, that sort of was a bolt from the blue that dominated us from without, is very different than the idea of the left, perhaps the Gen X left, the anarchist left, the post-left, whatever you want to call it, of the 90s, WTO protests, et cetera, sort of moving on from this question of the old left's idea of a proletarian revolutionary subject, right? It was kind of this Maoist, identitarian revolutionary subject reimagined in and through the women's movement, gay and liberation movement, Black Power, et cetera. So those protest movements ultimately paved the way for a new era of capital accumulation, is the point.
Yeah.
They absolutely did. I mean, they lent themselves to the community politics organizing model of the Democrat Party, in and through the Clintons, who were in the DCCC. They were, and it was in and through the McGovern campaign of 1972. But I don't want to get into
None of those movements were left. They were liberal.
That is the point, Joel. That is the point, that they were absorbed by the Democrat Party. That is the point.
But it was defeated, and the Democrats learned their lesson from that.
The McGovern movement was not left. You guys aren't old enough to have been there.
Yes. So I digressed a bit too much,
you're
but the point.
constructing a false history. The left opposed McGovern. They always are. There were, of course, people who said, yeah, this is the best we're going to get, yada, yada,
No, I think we're
against
conflating the
war.
counterculture movement with the actual New Left. Of course, the actual New Left, we're considering it in Marxist terms. So I agree with you and not to conflate the two. However, what I'm just getting at, I digressed a bit too much, but what was neoliberalism? The Fordist regime of accumulation that Harvey called post-Fordist regime of accumulation in his book in 1989, or 1990, around there. He didn't yet call it neoliberalism, but that's what we now call it. What was neoliberalism implies that we are now entering a new era of capital accumulation in and through the political crisis, the fallout of the 2007 housing and financial crisis, and the resulting neo-social democratic movements, Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, the Euro crisis, obviously Bernie Sanders, Corbyn in the UK. So briefly, I'm sorry, I'm trying to speak quickly here because I want to get to all these people. If someone could at some point speak to the idea that neoliberalism is coming to an end, coming to a close, and that something new is emerging, we don't yet have a name for it, but potentially, maybe it's post-neoliberalism for now as a bookend. We'll see what happens. Okay. I'm asking a panelist. Okay.
So the problem, I think, is imagining that neoliberalism is a fundamentally different mode of, no, that's not the right term. It's fundamentally different than some other form of capitalism. So capitalism can have several different regimes of accumulation, has had several different regimes of accumulation. The 30 glorious years, as the French call them, post-World War II, were a mode of accumulation that has been superseded. I don't think that the mode of accumulation that came into force from the late 70s and through the 1980s has been superseded. I think if we're calling that neoliberalism, we're still living with it. There's a crisis of neoliberalism, which is expressed in the strong movements of opposition against it, but so far no one has posed an alternative that has any capacity to succeed.
Any of the other panelists? I just needed to interject a question for myself, but everyone, we're going to get to them right now, unless someone else has something.
Can I say one
Yes.
thing about that?
Yeah.
The difficulty for all of us in terms of describing what might be post-neoliberalism is that if it is going to emerge, it is taking shape right now. And
Can't see it.
it doesn't, it doesn't seem to have much of an emancipatory character. But I think there's a reluctance to look to the only force that might actually be attempting to create a new realm, new mode of accumulation, new what is it called? Anyway, like as David Harvey said, to get capitalism working again in a new way would be the Trump administration. And, there's not a lot to recommend it from my point of view, because it seems to be creating a lot of strife amongst what were formerly allies. There's still a war raging in Ukraine. There seems to be the potential for a nuclear conflict there that is unique. Now, that's not Trump's baby exclusively, but it is, I think, a consequence of the rearranging of the world order, and so the whatever post neoliberalism is going to be, it's a little scary. We don't really want to look at it. That's what I think.
Okay.
Thank you, Doug. Oh, sorry.
I'd just be really quick and say, if neoliberalism at the base of society for workers is atomization, is like impediments for collective action, then yeah, we're still going to be living in that. That's not going to change. In the 90s, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce would always try to get the U.S. labor regime overturned and be able to make everybody independent contractors. It was like this thing that they'd always try to do, and it got nowhere because it was just so destabilizing. It was kind of just like, tilting at windmills. Well, the apps have done that. Like Uber, all those, they've done that. And they did it through technology, not through political power. So, yeah, for workers, we're still going to be atomized. We're still going to have all impediments to collective action put up in front of us. So I don't know how, the people that own the society.
The New Deal era was also the welfare state itself was considered to be an impediment to working class organizing.
Yeah.
So the old era, the golden era, was also at the time by the New Left thought to be a force that was oppressing and suppressing working class power. That's just worth remembering that. It didn't do it quite the same way.
I mean, isn't that how all capitalist states are going to do that somehow?
Yeah.
Basically, extend benefits to so many workers that at some point we'll have a function for middle class that will be less concerned about organizing revolutions because of the benefits.
All right, we're gonna. I'm sorry.
We can take it further.
I'm sorry. We have a lot of people listening, and they just can't hear you if you're not at the mic. I'm really not trying to be annoying by saying the mic, but you're welcome to come back up. We're gonna move on to the next question right here. Go ahead.
Okay, so it seems to me that many, I guess this is for all the panelists if they want to chip in, it seems to me that many of the issues that currently plague the left is due, as you second panelist just said, the technologies and of neoliberalism, of atomizing. Now we're all gig workers instead of contracted employees, and it because of that, the left went away. But there's still a large maybe not large, but there is still there are so many small organizations or 100-person, 1,000-person political parties or cults of the same size with at least a left-wing desire. So I guess so I had to revise this a couple times because if strategy-wise, the new left succeeded on for the most part the cultural front, and then just totally abandoned the economic basis of leftism. Where do we go from here? How can I guess neoliberalism be over without a left-wing response to neoliberalism? I guess that's my question with regards to the
embedded in both your comment and part of the previous one is this notion that the Cultural Revolution was somehow opposed to the economic interests of the working class, which should have been the real center of gravity of left work. So I can tell you that there were plenty of times when I smoked pot on our lunch break with regular old workers who were not at all like coming from my background. And there were lots of young women who were part of the feminist movement. They might not have called themselves feminists, but they had a very different consciousness. I mean, first of all, the fact that we had women in the plant, and even women, some at that point already beginning to become skilled workers, electricians and machine repair people and such like that. So there was an element of the cultural movement that was apolitical. That was Haight-Ashbury. We thought Haight-Ashbury was silly. So to think of that as the left, yes, it happened, as I tried to lay out. The cultural movement and the political movements were in the same time, in the same place, and sometimes they intersected, sometimes they didn't. But the people who became socialists had complete disdain for hippie culture and all of that. The first thing that we did when we went into the factories was to give up a lot of that stuff that happened on college campuses or wherever else people came from. So it's a mistake to think of the cultural movement as being opposed to the more proper political movement. The New Left was defeated not primarily because it made political and ideological errors, which it did big time. The reason it was defeated was because there was an offensive against the working class globally, which ultimately manifested itself in neoliberalism becoming hegemonic in the United States, in Britain, and elsewhere eventually as well. So that neoliberalism really couldn't care, the neoliberal capital couldn't care in the slightest how much sex, drugs, and rock and roll you did. That was not their problem. Their problem was defeating the working class. And there was an insurgent working class in the late 60s and early 70s, and it was defeated.
I mean,
I'm sorry, but I actually have to go, so I want to thank everyone for having me on this panel, and
Thanks, Doug.
I have to, but it was great talking to you all.
Daniel Cohn-Bendit, Danny the Red, involved in the May 68 mass strike, student radical in France at the Sorbonne, said in 2008 that the New Left won socially and culturally, but lost politically. Thank God. Let's go to the next question.
Sure. So this is running late. I'll try to be precise and fairly concise. I have two questions. One is related to something that was asked earlier, but maybe a more precise, or at least has a different valence on the, I don't know, the skew of the question. This panel is titled, "What was neoliberalism?" What was neoliberalism? If neoliberalism is over or has mutated or been sublated in some capacity, maybe it's too early to tell the shape of this coming nightmare, but what are some factors that have been occurring over the past few years, past decade, past 15, 20 years, which might point towards it? And that's my first question. My second question relates to, fair enough. Well, feel free to address it whenever capacity you can and feel like. Second question is really related to Ian's point about the academy versus the rest of the working class. In some sense, the New Left was an outgrowth of the GI Bill. Students who were working class, came from working class household, maybe they were a GI themselves, or their parents had been a GI, and suddenly they could get educated and they learned about Marx in the academy. And maybe that was their downfall, but that very much was one of the large tendencies and the class and intellectual and sociological composition of the New Left. This was true in the United States with the GI Bill, like I said. It was also true in France. When the strike wave began on May 13th at the aviation factories and Renault factories, you had one common thread is you had wildcat strikes launched by young people, young students who couldn't get bureaucratic jobs, as accountants or medical practitioners or whatever, who were able to radicalize workers outside of the union bureaucracy. Of course, these events failed, as we all know, but my question is, what role does the academy and political education have for the future of the left? In what ways does the current decomposition of the academy we see, is that a bad thing or a good thing for the left? And where will the public intellectuals be that might, I don't know, help create a rebirth of the left, or at least a continuation of a sort of Marxian analytical understanding of history and politics?
You left out an important piece in your story about who the New Left was. In the 30s and 40s, you had lots of working class people who knew something about Marx. The split in the Communist Party was, yes, of course, the top leaders, the Trotskyists, were intellectuals, but there were lots of workers, and they led a huge strike in truck drivers in Minneapolis in 1934, I think it was, something like that. Where did that organic working class left go? It was smashed by McCarthyism. Every trade union that had communists in its leadership was thrown out of the AFL-CIO. All those individuals were driven out of the trade unions and blacklisted. My uncle never worked a day in his life in the airplane repair industry after 1952 or something like that. I don't remember the exact date. This was a huge, massive political assault on the communist left, which is, for better and worse, the left that there was in that era. And that meant that, yes, children of that generation, of people who were defeated in the McCarthy era, were big time in the New Left. Absolutely, they were. And college kids. But if they're looking, okay, so how are we going to be left now? Because our parents not only were defeated, but they were deprived of their livelihoods. I mean, real horror stories. I mean, not compared to what goes on these days, maybe. So there was a disconnect. And yeah, the left, the New Left was heavily student-based. And for that reason, people who looked at that said, oh, we have to go back to the factories. And the only problem with that is that we decided to do that just as the structure of the working class was changing, and that strategy couldn't possibly succeed, even to the extent that it had in the 30s and 40s, which was, of course, limited by the New Deal and its racism and all. Yeah, we understand that. So it's a mistake to blame either the culture or the university for the failure. The failure is first and foremost a successful defeat of the communist left and its annexes, and then coming to a realization that you could rebuild a left in a certain way and circumstances in which the working class that you were trying to organize was being rapidly transformed and became much less organizable. So again, that's not because people were bozos or politically wrong-headed. I mean, there was every tendency of the left that you could imagine present in the United States between, I don't know, let's say 1967 and 1977. Not a single one of them did any better than the other. It was all defeated. And to say, oh, well, that's because you guys were into too much pot or whatever, no, that's not gonna, that's a silly argument. It doesn't deal with the structure of society, which is, after all, what Marxism tries to analyze. I'm not saying that culture isn't important. No. One of the big lessons that we did learn in the academy, those of us who came out of the factories, went to back to college, became professors like me. One of the big lessons that we learned is that culture matters a great deal. I mean, what are culture wars? What is it all about there? So people do really care. They're serious about their Christianity. They're serious about their nuclear families. They're serious about all that stuff. And, okay, it's not all terrible. The mistake is to think that that's the center of gravity of the struggle. It's there, it's real, it's part of the struggle. Capital mobilizes it, but it can't be the center of gravity. Okay. Where are we going post neoliberalism, if there's going to be such a thing? That's not a topic that I'm big on. I mean, that I really know a whole lot about. But let's speculate, because we don't know, actually. You can't see in the present 10 or 20 years in the future what it's going to be like usually. Let's imagine, though, that these tech bros who anteed up $1 million each to go to Trump's inauguration and whatever, they're going to stay in the driver's seat, and the Democrats are now going to gerrymander the 2026 election so that it's impossible for the Democrats to win the House. And unless the Democrats win in Maine, there's no chance for them to win the Senate. And that means that we're going to have Trumpite dictatorship, whether or not Trump stays in power or not. J.D. Vance will succeed him. And that's going to be the shape of the political regime allied with this tech bro scene here, which represents billions and billions and billions of dollars, and not only in the United States, but globally. So could that be a new form of capital accumulation with neo-fascist accoutrements? Yeah, we could be facing that. I'm not sure. I hope not. It'll make your lives horrible.
Ian, would you like to respond to the question at all?
I think the main project the left needs to work on is building other centers of power in society past the academy. I've been the stick a little far on it. I know I do. But right now, it just, so much of our discourse, podcasts, is really centered around that. So if the universities are going to get smashed, and there's going to be an overproduction of elites, which is usually destabilizing, many of these people usually turn to the left because they, Doug's not here. Maybe they've been radicalized by a book or something. That happens. It does. I think that could be really good if it's approached thoughtfully, and that there's just intentional cultivation of other leadership that can counterbalance academic and intellectual work. And unfortunately, often when that comes up, it's like people being stupid at demonstrations or whatever. Those are the other leaders that, like, the left lionizes. This is the guy that gets arrested for doing something super stupid. Like, those are the two places that we find our leadership from, and we need new places, which isn't to say that there's not a role for everything. There's even a role for that guy that did something stupid at the demo and got arrested.
So I think we're going to do one last question from the audience, and then we're going to do closing statements from the panelists. We got a couple of forward.
Thank you guys for doing this whole thing. It's been really cool, and I actually think there's a lot more points of commonality maybe that come up slowly as kind of themes among you guys as you're kind of playing off each other than like your overall, like whether Joe, you and Doug are going to be best friends necessarily captures directly. But I mean, even just like the way that Uber kept coming up and led to some of Doug's last statements when he was talking about like, well, like this guy's biggest dream, I was asking him and he was, maybe I could be a computer repair technician because that's something that somebody's going to have to keep doing. And so that actually does kind of connect with this idea of like you were saying, Joe, when you're in the 1970s and you're in Detroit and you're looking about, can we have a labor action, and can we convince the workers to strike? I don't know. They were laid off 4 months ago. They've got all these payments because they've got their boat, their cabin, their mortgage, their marriage, their kids.
Sending their kids to college.
Yeah, exactly. Well, but so mortgaging your family to send someone to do unpaid work at school that they have to pay to do, that's kind of a lose-lose, And so is not working, because the only way that you can do your auto plant work is to sign up for this contract, or sign the other contract, or not work. But I mean, when you talk about what happens after now, it seems to me that, for one thing, work isn't the same as job. And so if somebody's dream is to be an auto, is to do auto-related work or to be a computer repair technician, how can we allow that to happen for at least that one person? Because they also are the tech bros of the next wave. And also, you're obviously, Joe, you're this huge wealth of knowledge because you have family in Israel and you've been to Israel, and you're magnetic in how you're able to kind of share the narratives of history. But we're also looking at, when we're talking about the end of neoliberalism, we're also talking about an end of this sort of historicizing, where each of us is part of a generation, and whatever our horrible experiences are, these are just symbolic of the overall, how it's going to come down to a paragraph. A way that we could know more about what's going on in Palestine and Israel would be opportunities for U.S. Americans to go live there and to go experience it and to stream it and to share it. I mean, we have to look at what are ways of helping us know more.
Now people are doing that.
But I mean, I don't know. Ian, something that I really appreciated was two things. One was, you brought some real numbers, consequences. I think that it sounds like we can get a little bit precious about what's our experience and what's our priority with working and with jobs and with the academy and the things that we're interested in. But these things have real consequences. 200,000 people dead, 75,000 people dead, 75,000 people dead, 100,000 people dead in Argentina, 100,000 people dead in Chile. U.S. supported administrations there. In Iraq and Afghanistan, we don't even know how many we've killed. The estimated civilian casualties are over 1 million in Iraq and Afghanistan, and with a similar number that have been slightly maimed. The injured, also over 1 million, and then 4 million refugees. But it's almost like there's this inverse proportion between how easy it is to talk about it as a story versus what's the real lived experience. But so I guess what if something that we could attach to ourselves as a label, identify as a socialist, or I'm a witness to the U.S.-Israeli genocide because I've walked the streets, isn't necessarily if it's not who we are that helps us to participate in moving the conversation forward to where it's about more than the Democrats. What are actions? What are concrete actions? And I don't know. It seems like it you talked about. I think something that came up was the dignity of work. That it needs to be based on. Ian, you said workers is a broader demographic for us to try to relate to versus socialists. Ian, are there any ideas that occur to you in terms of ways that we can try to, I don't know, I guess what's a way to have this daily conversation on the daily of us all as workers and people who like things and love things and share things? And
I've recently got involved with a project that's trying to do like civil social organizing, and we're looking at sort of like low stakes, easy to participate in, not particularly political organizing in communities, and not just any communities, but trying to understand the communities that you're working in by demographic research, which is pretty easy to do nowadays. And that is just trying to rebuild social ability between working class people and like distinct geographic areas, so that they start relating to each other and finding the commonalities in like their struggles. And our task isn't really to solve their problems, like maybe refer them out to different organizations that are working on that, but to be sort of like a low filter pass, maybe. But try to do that in places that you know that's where working class people live, instead of just wherever. So
you have something in common to start with because you're all there.
And it's a question of trying to bring territorial organizing back, like into to the front a little bit, I think, so that people can like have their notion of class consciousness reinforced in where they live. And, you know, yeah, I think we're decades from having a socialist party. I think we got to do that work for a long time.
So that sounds to me like good work, but we should know that historically, the left considered neighborhood organizing to be an inferior form of organizing to organizing in factories. That was just the way people thought. I'm not even making a judgment. If we look at what happened in Chicago in the last couple of days, neighborhoods organized themselves to fight the feds and to protect community members who were being seized by ICE. Now, I don't know what was going on in all those neighborhoods before. I would imagine some kind of stuff of the sort that you're talking about, but I don't really know. I don't know Chicago well at all. But if we think about that moment of what happens when people do get in the street and start fighting ICE and Customs and Border Patrol. Not with armed struggle, no, they're not doing that. They're throwing tear gas canisters back at them and other stuff like that that they don't like. That's a golden moment when people do understand in a big way that the system is against them and can have certain conversations that you don't usually happen. So we might be having lots of occasions for that sort of thing, and they might be happening in places where there hasn't been a lot of community organizing to build on. There's all sorts of things like that. I mean, that happened in Los Angeles too, in a less dramatic way and in a more limited way. So this is going to be going on because people of color, and especially Hispanics, are being attacked by the Trump administration. And we'll see what people learn in the struggle to defend them and what that will result in. Is it going to result in the emergence of a socialist party? No, probably not. Most likely what it will result in is the election of more social democrats, and maybe down the road a split between the social democrats and the corporate democrats, the people like Schumer and Pelosi and so on. That would be a good thing. It would not be something that is going to bring socialism to power. I mean, we have to think about the historical process. So I wasn't happy with your notion that there's something wrong with telling stories. The only way that human beings understand who we are is by telling stories about ourselves. And it matters what stories we tell. So Doug was trying to tell you a story about Israel and about the unity of Israeli and Palestinian workers, which is a Trotskyist fairy tale that's 100 years old and never worked. That's why I got so excited. That's why I got so excited about what he was saying, because that has been tried and failed many times over, and there is a new left theory to explain why that would fail. Now, that new left theory might not be right. I'm not going to say that because people of my generation, wasn't me. No, I had nothing to do with this. Friends, but not me. I'm not going to say that because people of my generation invented that theory to explain why there will not be unity between the Jewish working class and the Arab working class in Israel, Palestine. Maybe they're wrong, but there is a theory that he had no idea about because he had some older Trotskyist notion that never worked out. So it matters what story you tell, and sometimes it's helpful to go to the university and to become more skilled at figuring out what is and isn't evidence. I mean, some of the stuff that he thought was evidence, you'd flunk a history test for that. So it matters what's real and what's not real, and what is actual evidence as opposed to rhetoric. And sure, today, because of the sociological developments since World War II, the left is overly academic, and a lot of what passes for left activity is airy theorizing. But I don't think you can do without it. So the question is, what's the balance? And today the balance is wrong. There's no question about that. I think all three of us would agree about that.
Actually, I feel like I was going to prompt you guys to say what you thought about the future, of like working class or socialist organizing. But it sounds like you were kind of already getting there.
Yeah, we got there.
So I want to kind of go in a slightly different direction, and maybe I could just get you guys to answer this last bit, and that could essentially be the closing statement. Because I think we've gone on for so long, we actually have heard a lot from you in particular, Joel. Thank you. Is socialism worth fighting for at all? It sounds like there are a lot of, just to be perfectly frank, a lot of excuses as to why it's no longer tenable, and that maybe all that's tenable is some vague post-political form of community activism, community organizing, or something that can pave the way for some form of harm reduction, even as it's absorbed pretty conspicuously into Democrat Party social movementism. You earlier, Joel, said that the left, of course, has nothing to do with the Democrat Party, has no connection to the Democrat Party. That's an absurd idea that it does. But I would say it's actually an equally absurd idea to say that the left has nothing or no connection to the Republican Party. That's something we don't need to say. It sounds absurd, right? No one's ever said that before because they don't need to. So if they're saying the former statement, it's because they need to. And so maybe perhaps the left has failed for several generations now because of itself, because of its own failures. You could disagree with that potentially, but if in Rosa Luxemburg's idea of socialism or barbarism, almost mapping onto Patrick Henry's liberty or death, if socialism isn't worth fighting for, then what the hell are we doing? We've got a room full of people who are very young, and I just want to hear from you guys explicitly. Do you think it's worth fighting for? Do you think that a new era of capital accumulation poses a new opportunity for new people, or not?
Maybe. Yeah, I'm serious. Maybe. Because first of all, we don't know what the outlines of that new era of capital accumulation might actually be yet. It's too inchoate for us to know. And okay, we have to acknowledge that all struggles for socialism have failed to date, right? There's no place where there's socialism, so by definition, it's failed. the classic Trotskyist explanation for that failure is wrong ideology. That I totally reject. Because when you're in the middle of a struggle, if you want to win that struggle, and you had ideas A, B, and C going into that struggle, and it turns out that that's not going to work, you change your ideas very quickly. And in part, you change your ideas because all these people, because you cannot win a struggle unless all these new people who didn't have any of those ideas before they joined the struggle came into it, and they don't agree with your Trotskyist Fourth International transitional program or whatever you got there. So a social dynamic is created that reshapes whatever political, social, cultural ideas went into the movement. So the fact that the movement hasn't succeeded is an expression of the fact that capital has been stronger. And at the moment when there was a question about whether labor or capital was stronger, in the 20s and 30s, we got fascism. And we might have that again now, even though the labor movement and working classes are nowhere near as strong as they were 100 years ago. But apparently enough of a threat so that a very substantial chunk, and in fact the most powerful chunks of capital today, have lined up behind Trump. But all those tech bros, they were Democrats 10, 15 years ago, if they had a political party at all. I mean, they used to play basketball down the street from me when they founded Facebook, and that's what they were, is basketball players who knew how to code. I mean, they weren't thinking about politics. They grew into this as oh yeah, this is going to work for us. This is going to multiply the accumulation of capital for us. So,
or be fun.
well, it's both. Yes, they think they're having fun too. We're not having any fun. They're having all. Yeah.
They accumulate fun.
Yeah, I absolutely. That is part. That is part of the culture. That we're smarter, and we know how to have more fun, and we have more expensive toys, and yeah, I mean. You know, I spent 35 years at Stanford. I know a little bit about the culture of Silicon Valley.
Okay. Ian, would you like to give your concluding remarks?
I mean, I wouldn't blame anybody for just, like, deciding they just want to get a hobby. It's a fair enough choice.
I have a
and, you know, people have organized in terrible situations all over the world, way worse than we're facing right now. Like, even the worst of the Trumpism, it has been far worse for a lot of people. And and not all those people survived, but they did produce some beautiful things that expressed, like, a deep human commitment to freedom. And that's what I want to see. And I think that capitalism won't deliver that. And so far, I've seen capitalism, shit in one hand, and not much anything better in the other. So maybe it's not going to be called socialism. I don't know. I'm not, like, I don't have to put a Marx sticker on it. But if we want to struggle for human freedom, it's probably going to be some kind of socialism.
The struggle is also its own value. It's the personal relationships that you make in the process of the struggle. It's the culture that is produced, the music, the art, the novels that are produced as a result of the struggle. It's the expansion of human imagination as a result of the struggle. And will we ever win in some absolute way? Probably not.
Okay. Well, with that, let's give us a round of applause.
Thank you all for staying.
Yeah, they deserve a round of applause.
If you're interested in receiving notifications about our upcoming events, there is a mailing list which you can sign up for. Audrey will be holding the sign-up sheet. Please come to her if you're interested.